Sometimes, justice doesn't need a courtroom. It doesn't need a gavel or a lawyer. Sometimes, all it takes is a single moment. One moment where masks fall off, where eyes widen, where the truth walks into the room and makes everyone stop pretending. What you're about to hear might just change the way you look at a stranger forever. Because this didn't happen in some far-off land. It happened here, in a place like yours, to a man like many others. His name was Elijah Jones, a black father, a protector. The kind of man who didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. The kind who worked long hours, came home late, and still managed to show up for every parent-teacher meeting. The kind who kept his promises. And today, he was keeping one more. He had promised his son, Darius, that he'd be front and center on his graduation day. Recording every step, smiling the whole time, telling him afterward, "That's my boy." But that's not what happened. Two men in uniform watched him walk in, and all they saw was a black man. And to them, that was suspicious enough. They didn't ask who he was. They just assumed everything and acted with the kind of authority that has ruined far too many moments like this. What they didn't know, what they never imagined, was who Elijah really was. And the moment they found out, everything changed. Now let me tell you what really happened. It was a warm Saturday morning in Jefferson, Texas. The kind of morning that carries hope in the air. The kind where everything feels possible. Families were already arriving at Jefferson High School, streaming in with proud smiles, holding gift bags, flowers, and helium balloons that danced in the breeze. You could hear laughter. You could feel the pride. Fathers adjusting ties, mothers dabbing their eyes, grandparents gripping the arms of chairs a little tighter. This was more than just a ceremony. This was a milestone. Among the crowd, a sleek black SUV pulled into the parking lot. The door opened slowly, and Elijah Jones stepped out. He didn't rush. He moved with calm precision, like a man who understood the weight of the moment. His suit was navy blue and spotless. The fabric hugged his broad frame like it was tailored just for this day. His shoes, glossy enough to catch a reflection. He looked down briefly, brushed some invisible lint off his sleeve, then adjusted his silver cufflinks. The camcorder in his right hand rested like a familiar extension of himself. Steady, focused, ready, he paused for a moment near the curb, eyes scanning the building. He took a breath. That quiet kind of breath men take when they're trying to hold back a smile that's too big to contain. He wasn't there to make a scene. He wasn't there to be noticed. He was just there to be a father, to witness the moment his son walked into the next chapter of life. Darius Jones. 18 years old, valedictorian, honor student, full scholarship to Morehouse. Elijah had worked 2 jobs at one point to keep Darius in the right schools. He'd spent sleepless nights making sure the electricity stayed on, the fridge was never empty, and the boy always had a lunch to carry. This day, it was as much his as it was Darius's. As Elijah made his way toward the auditorium, he noticed families taking pictures on the school lawn, others crowding near the entrance. Some nodded politely, a few smiled, most didn't even look twice. But not far off, just past the doors he was headed toward, 2 officers stood talking. Not about safety, not about the graduates, but about something else entirely. And while Elijah adjusted his tie once more and pressed record on his camcorder, those 2 officers had already made a decision about him. He didn't know it yet, but they'd already labeled him, and soon they would act on it. A storm was gathering, and Elijah was walking straight into it, standing just inside the auditorium entrance beneath a large school banner that read, "Class of Champions, Jefferson High 2025, were officers Daniels and Rick. Their uniforms were pressed, belts tight, radios clipped to their shoulders, arms folded like statues planted just beyond the double doors. To the casual eye, they looked like men on duty, just doing their job, keeping the peace. But peace wasn't really what they were watching for. Not truly. They weren't looking for safety hazards. They weren't scanning for fire code violations. They weren't even looking at the crowd. They were watching types. The kind of quiet surveillance that comes not from training, but from bias. Subtle, intentional, dangerous. They stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes lazily drifting across the flow of families. A mother pushing a stroller. A tall teenager high-fiving his dad. A white man in khakis and a red polo holding a Starbucks cup. Normal, safe, expected. And then Elijah walked in, alone, composed, dark-skinned, and completely unbothered. He wasn't looking around nervously. He wasn't fidgeting. He didn't seem confused or out of place. He was just present, poised, unshaken. But to Daniels and Rick, that calmness read differently. It didn't say, "Father here for a proud moment." It said, "Attitude." It said, "Problem." Rick tilted his head slightly. "Keep an eye on that one," he said, under his breath. Daniels didn't even ask why, didn't question it, didn't say, "Why him?" He just nodded. His jaw tightened. His fingers tapped his radio. They hadn't seen Elijah do anything wrong. He hadn't spoken a word. He hadn't even looked in their direction. But in that moment, they'd already drawn a line. In their minds, he didn't belong. He didn't fit. Didn't carry himself with the deference they expected. He wasn't smiling at them, wasn't trying to make himself smaller. He was just sat, walking forward, proud, peaceful, like he had every right to be there. And that was enough to set them on edge. They didn't know he was a father, didn't know he was a decorated officer, didn't know he'd been sworn in as the new police chief just 2 weeks earlier. They didn't know anything, but it didn't matter, because the kind of prejudice they carried didn't require evidence. It only needed presence, and to them, Elijah Jones was a presence that had to be handled, watched, controlled, not for what he'd done, but for what he looked like. They didn't ask who he was. They didn't care. They'd already decided he was a problem, just waiting to happen, standing just inside the auditorium entrance beneath a large school banner that read, "Class of Champions, Jefferson High 2025, were officers Daniels and Rick. Their uniforms were pressed, belts tight, radios clipped to their shoulders, arms folded like statues planted just beyond the double doors. To the casual eye, they looked like men on duty, just doing their job, keeping the peace. But peace wasn't really what they were watching for. Not truly. They weren't looking for safety hazards. They weren't scanning for fire code violations. They weren't even looking at the crowd. They were watching types. The kind of quiet surveillance that comes not from training, but from bias. Subtle, intentional, dangerous. They stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes lazily drifting across the flow of families. A mother pushing a stroller. A tall teenager high-fiving his dad. A white man in khakis and a red polo holding a Starbucks cup. Normal, safe, expected. And then Elijah walked in, alone, composed, dark-skinned, and completely unbothered. He wasn't looking around nervously. He wasn't fidgeting. He didn't seem confused or out of place. He was just present, poised, unshaken. But to Daniels and Rick, that calmness read differently. It didn't say, "Father here for a proud moment." It said, "Attitude." It said, "Problem." Rick tilted his head slightly. "Keep an eye on that one," he said, under his breath. Daniels didn't even ask why, didn't question it, didn't say, "Why him?" He just nodded. His jaw tightened. His fingers tapped his radio. They hadn't seen Elijah do anything wrong. He hadn't spoken a word. He hadn't even looked in their direction. But in that moment, they'd already drawn a line. In their minds, he didn't belong. He didn't fit. Didn't carry himself with the deference they expected. He wasn't smiling at them, wasn't trying to make himself smaller. He was just sat, walking forward, proud, peaceful, like he had every right to be there, and that was enough to set them on edge. They didn't know he was a father, didn't know he was a decorated officer, didn't know he'd been sworn in as the new police chief just 2 weeks earlier. They didn't know anything, but it didn't matter, because the kind of prejudice they carried didn't require evidence. It only needed presence, and to them, Elijah Jones was a presence that had to be handled, watched, controlled, not for what he'd done, but for what he looked like. They didn't ask who he was. They didn't care. They'd already decided he was a problem, just waiting to happen. Outside, Elijah stood still beneath the harsh afternoon sun. The graduation music had already begun playing inside, muffled behind the thick metal doors that had just swung shut. He didn't move. He didn't protest. He didn't plead with the officers to let him back in. He just stood there. The camcorder was still in his hand, the red light blinking slowly, as if it too was confused. He had brought it to record his son's greatest moment. But now, it was capturing something else. Something he hadn't expected. Something he'd lived through before, but never like this. His eyes lingered on the door for a long moment. Inside that building, hundreds of families were cheering, clapping, crying with joy. Inside, his son, his world, was likely scanning the crowd for his father's face. But Elijah wasn't there. He was standing outside, alone, not because he did anything wrong, but because 2 officers saw his skin before they saw his smile, saw their own discomfort before his humanity. He could have yelled, could have demanded answers, could have reached for his wallet, pulled out his badge, and thrown it in their faces, because Elijah wasn't just some man off the street. He was the newly appointed chief of police for the entire Jefferson District, the first black man to hold that position in the town's history, the kind of achievement that made front-page news, the kind of moment that should have brought him honor. But instead, here he was, disrespected, dismissed, humiliated. But Elijah didn't raise his voice, didn't lose his composure. Because today wasn't about ego, it wasn't about power, it was about principle. And more than that, it was about his son. He leaned back against the brick wall, closing his eyes briefly as the breeze moved across his face. He wasn't angry, not yet. What he felt was deeper than anger. It was disappointment, not in himself, but in the world that still needed reminders like this. Darius deserved this moment. He had earned it with hard work, long nights, and endless sacrifice. And Elijah, he'd promised to be there. So he waited, not because he had to, but because walking away would have made him exactly what they wanted him to be. Gone, invisible, dismissed. He wasn't going to give them that. He was going to stand his ground. With his back against the wall and the weight of silence sitting heavy on his shoulders, Elijah Jones waited. Inside the school, while the ceremony continued in its carefully scripted rhythm, honor cords, polite applause, and students lined up backstage, there was a ripple, small at first, almost unnoticeable. A teacher leaned over and whispered something to the principal. The principal, mid-sentence reviewing the program, stopped. His brow furrowed. "Elijah Jones?" he repeated quietly. The teacher nodded. "Yeah, he's Darius's dad." The principal blinked. His lips parted slightly, confused, unsure. "Elijah Jones, the new chief?" Another nod. Without missing a beat, the principal leaned toward a school board member seated in the front row. He whispered the same words, and that board member, now visibly tense, leaned into the mayor's ear. Elijah Jones was removed from the building. The mayor sat up straight. "What did you say?" His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the space between them like a whip. "Elijah Jones, he asked again, this time with weight. "The police chief?" The board member gave the smallest of nods, and that's all it took. The mayor didn't wait. He stood and walked briskly down the side aisle, his polished shoes clicking with purpose, cutting behind the curtains of the stage. A second later, a flustered secretary was flagged down. Her eyes widened when the mayor gave his order. "Find Chief Jones now. Bring him inside." The secretary didn't ask questions. She turned and hurried out of sight. Back outside, Elijah was still leaning against the wall, arms crossed loosely, calm on the surface. The doors flew open. The secretary rushed out, breathless. "Chief Jones," she stammered. "Sir, the mayor would like to see you." Elijah gave her a long, unreadable look. He didn't say anything for a moment, just pushed himself off the wall and walked forward slowly, the camcorder still hanging from his hand. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. Tension hummed like electricity behind the stage. The principal stood stiffly. The mayor, red-faced, was pacing slightly. And then the door opened, and Elijah walked in. For the first time, both Officers Daniels and Rick saw him again, this time in a very different light. Daniels instinctively shifted his weight. His face went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came. Rick looked like a man who had just solved a terrible puzzle far too late. He took a half step back, blinking. Elijah walked past them without a glance. He stood beside the principal and the mayor, straightened his jacket collar, and turned to face them. Daniels stammered, You're... Elijah raised a brow ever so slightly. "Yes," he said quietly. "Chief Elijah Jones." His voice was calm, cold, controlled. "And I believe," he added, looking straight at both officers now, "you owe me an apology." The ceremony, which had been marching along with polite formality, student by student, name by name, suddenly paused. The principal, still visibly shaken, walked slowly up to the microphone at center stage. The room fell silent, curious eyes tracking his every step. He cleared his throat once, then again. The microphone hissed briefly as he leaned forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice trembling just enough to betray the weight of what he was about to say. "Before we continue with this ceremony, I need to address something that happened earlier." You could hear the shift in the room, the silence thickening. Someone stopped mid-clap. Someone else turned toward the stage with narrowed eyes. Something was coming, and no one knew what. The principal looked down briefly at his notes, then back up again. "This morning," he continued, "a parent, a man who came here to celebrate his son, was approached, questioned, and ultimately removed from this auditorium wrongfully. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. I want to be clear. That man did nothing wrong. He presented his ticket. He followed every protocol, and yet he was made to feel like a threat, treated like an outsider. That was our mistake, and mine personally. A longer pause. He took a slow breath, then steadied his voice. That man is not only a parent. He is an honorable leader in this community, our newly appointed Chief of Police, Chief Elijah Jones, and he is here to witness his son walk across this stage. Gasps, hands over mouths, whispers swirling like a sudden gust in a still room. Then applause. First from the back, then the sides, then the middle rows. A standing ovation, built not just out of shock, but out of a deep, uneasy admiration. Some clapped with pride, some with guilt, some because they didn't know what else to do. And then Elijah stepped forward. He walked up to this, a stage slowly, deliberately. No anger in his stride, no bitterness in his face, just presence. He didn't shout, didn't scold, didn't demand. He stood at the microphone and looked out into the sea of faces, some wide-eyed, some bowed in shame. And he said, "Today, I was reminded of how far we've come, and how far we still have to go. I didn't come here to teach a lesson. I came here to celebrate my son. But sometimes, the lesson finds you anyway." He paused, his voice calm, but unmistakably firm. "I'm not angry, because today isn't about me. It's about a young man who worked hard, stayed out of trouble, stayed in his books, and made something of himself. It's about every father, every mother, who just wants to be seen for who they are, not for what others fear." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "So I'm going to do what I came here to do." The principal stepped aside. Moments later, the announcer called the next name, Darius Elijah Jones. The auditorium erupted with applause. And as Darius walked across the stage, tall, poised, his eyes glistening with emotion, Elijah clapped, louder than anyone else in that room. Not out of pride alone, but because he knew exactly what it had cost to get to that moment. Daniels and Rick were placed on administrative leave within 48 hours. The news spread quickly. Local papers, online blogs, a few national headlines. Police chief wrongfully removed from son's graduation by his own officers. The irony didn't go unnoticed. The department issued a formal apology, carefully worded, signed by the commissioner. It spoke of values and diversity and the need for retraining. Standard language meant to cover embarrassment more than offer healing. The school board followed suit. A statement from the superintendent, promises of new racial sensitivity programs, mandatory bias training, community roundtables. But Elijah didn't attend any of the meetings, didn't respond to press inquiries, didn't post a single comment online. Because for him, none of that really mattered. Not the headlines, not the politics, not even the consequences the officers would eventually face, because the moment that mattered was waiting just beyond the spotlight. When the final name had been called and the caps began to fly into the air, when the crowd erupted in cheers and families surged forward in a wave of joy, Darius found him. He didn't wait for a gap, didn't care about the photographers or the crowd. He ran straight through the bodies, past the folding chairs, diploma in hand. And when he reached his father, he didn't say much. He wrapped his arms around Elijah and held on tight, tight like he never wanted to let go. "I saw everything, Dad," he whispered against his shoulder, "and I've never been more proud to be your son." Elijah didn't say anything at first. He just nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. And for the first time that day, he allowed himself to cry. Sometimes, the strongest thing a man can do is say nothing. Not because he has nothing to say, but because his silence speaks louder than the noise around him. Elijah didn't shout, didn't fight to prove a point. He stood, and in standing, he reminded everyone what dignity looks like when it's cornered. He didn't demand respect. He earned it by rising above the hate, by choosing pride over power, and by showing the world that character will always be louder than prejudice. And those two officers, they'll remember that day, not for the crowd, not for the ceremony, not even for the consequences, but for the man they dismissed, and the silence that revealed who he truly was. Next time you see someone, look deeper, because behind every face, there's a story, and behind every story, there's a human being. This was Elijah's